Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Webunion, and in this one there are significant developments across the front line. Russians have managed to advance further across the border in the northern section of the front line in the Kharkiv direction, where they're expanding the zone of control within Vovchansk and along the border to the north of Kostyantynivka. The Russians also managed to advance to the northwest of Lyman as they continue striking the Ukrainian positions along the supply lines leading into the city. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Kostyantynivka from the southeast, where they are fighting over the dacha areas outside of the city to cut off the supply lines to Ukrainian forward positions to the southeast of it and to get closer and establish a front line alongside the outskirts of the city. The Russians also managed to advance within Pokrovsk to the southwest in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region in the eastern outskirts of it, as well as in the eastern outskirts of Zaporizhia, where the Russians continued offensive operations across the border between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions along the first and second lines of defense. The Russians also managed to advance in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region alongside the Dnieper River. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to continue the advances across the river line here, the river line that splits Stepnoyersk in the northern and southern directions. The Russians have been active in the western outskirts of the dacha area here west of Stepnoyersk along the Dnieper River for a couple of weeks. Additional geolocated footage now confirms the Russian presence exists and is expanding here along the Dnieper River, similar to the Russian progress through Kamyansk and in the Bathny direction. Russians are not just pushing into Stepnoyersk, where fighting is taking place on the eastern parts of the town, but they're also expanding some control in the dacha area to gain control over Stepnoyersk, the dacha area, and the fortified positions in the vicinity to start the battle over the defensive lines here in the western outskirts of the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region. The Russians have proper logistical lines to the front line here in the western outskirts, where they have logistical hubs such as Berdyansk and Melitopol, which can push through towards Tokmak, push in the direction of Oryhev in the center and Vasilivka in the west, before moving onwards towards Kamyansk and upwards towards Stepnoyersk or through Tokmak towards Oryhev. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are putting a lot of their logistic capabilities to Vasilivka, where they then supply their forces in the western outskirts to strengthen offensive operations along the first line of defense, where the objective of the Russians is to gain control over the defensive line west of Oryhev, open up a road to Oryhev itself through Melishcherbaki and Stepove along the highway connected through Vasilivka, and gain control over Oryhev itself with the combined effort from the western, southern and eastern directions. Gain control over Oryhev will allow them to gain control over yet another logistical hub in this Zaporizhia region, combined with the efforts on the eastern flank to gain control over the first and second lines of defense in this direction. Gaining control over Huliaipole as a logistical hub and gaining control over Oryhev will allow the Russians to gain control over the majority of the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhia region. With the entirety of the first line of defense under their control, the Russians will be able to launch a significant offensive in the Zaporizhia region towards gaining full control over the region itself. The Russian offensive operations to the east of these defensive lines continues on the northern and southern flanks of the first line of defense. Following the capture of the fortified positions alongside it, the Russians are leveling the front line, gaining full control over Novoivanivka here in the northern flank, and advancing westwards of Olhivske in the southern flank to continue their pressure on the defensive line of the Ukrainians and along the river line to gain control over the settlements here along the river line north of Melnivka, where their objective is to gain control over these defensive lines and the settlements around them, improve their positions and push in the direction of Huliaipole. In the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region near Novopavlivka, the Russians continue their offensive operations along the defensive line here. The objective is to flank the supply lines of the Ukrainian forces to cut off their fighting power in the direction of Dashna, securing the southern flank and developing the offensive operations in the direction of Novopavlivka, where fighting is taking place in the direction of Moravka or the settlement and the fortified positions, and now also along the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region to develop offensive operations to the east and to the south of Novopavlivka, which can act as the first logistical hub for the Russian forces within the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the direction of Pokrovsk itself, the Russians have been geolocated in the western residential area of the city. The Russians are here working on consolidating their positions on the western parts of it to gain control over the 20406 highway leading into Pokrovsk from the western flank, gain control over the E50 highway as well in the industrial area to the northwest of the city, which will cut off the main supply line to the Ukrainian forces operating within the city, as well as securing the western flank completely for the Russian forces to significantly improve their own logistical situation for their forces into the city to develop offensive operations further and gain full control over Pokrovsk, which will significantly improve the logistics of the Russian forces within the western parts of the Donetsk region and the eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region to develop offensive operations on a larger scale here in the western parts and eastern parts of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. As for the direction of Kostyantynivka itself, the Russians continued offensive operations to gain full control over the fortified positions and the dacha area here to the east of Kostyantynivka. The objective is to cut off the highway supplying the Ukrainian forces within Pleshivka, Klebenvik, Ivanopilia, and the settlements here to the south of Kostyantynivka. By cutting off this highway, the supplies to the Ukrainian forces will be significantly lowered to the point where their defensive operations would be unsustainable to the south, which will allow the Russians to gain control over these positions and develop offensive operations towards Klebenvik, Pleshivka, and Ivanopilia to gain control of these settlements and have a road into Kostyantynivka from the south as well as from the east. Where to the northeast, the Russians have already reached the outskirts of the city, which will mean the front line will be aligned with the city of Kostyantynivka to the south, southeast, and east of the city. While at the same time, Russians can develop offensive operations in the direction of Novomarkova, Markova, and Maiske in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, as well as the settlements here on the western flank, centered around Stinky, to launch offensive operations towards Kostyantynivka from the northern and northeastern directions. The Russians also consider offensive operations in the direction of Lyman to the northwest of the city, where they are launching offensive operations along Shandriholove, gaining control over the western outskirts of the settlement, and continuing the offensive operations within the settlement itself, where fighting takes place. The Ukrainians are present within some of these buildings and basements. The Russians are slowly moving from building to building to clear every single one of them to gain full control over the settlement, while the Ukrainians are using FPV drones to strike the Russian forces while they're moving from these buildings. This makes it a lengthy process for the Russian forces, where they are often exposed to Ukrainian drones. Once the settlement is cleared from Ukrainian forces, the Russians will develop offensive operations towards Novoselivka on both banks of the river line, as well as Sterilove, to gain control over additional supply lines leading into the Lyman direction from the northwest, and develop offensive operations on the western flank of the city to completely cut off the connection by land from the western flank and allow their forces to connect from Sarishna in the east through Stavki in the center to Dobryshev in the west, along with the positions in the direction of Yampil, where the Russian forces storming that settlement as well. The Russians are now getting very close to aligning the front line with Lyman on the northern flank of the Sloviansk-Kostyantynivka line. Further north in the direction of the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, the Russians have significantly expanded their zone of control along the border, where they've passed through additional lines of defense of the Ukrainians along the border itself, reaching the outskirts of Odradne. The Russians are slowly developing their offensive operations along the border area, where the objective is to connect their forces here in the Oskar River line direction from the Varishna all the way to the forces along the border area, getting control of a significant portion of the border section, which will improve the logistics of the Russian forces across the Oskar River line through the border area, and also to expand offensive capabilities in the direction of the northeastern outskirts of the Kharkiv region to connect their forces between Kupiansk, Varishna, Milove, and Vovchansk. Speaking of Vovchansk, the Russians continue offensive operations on the southern bank of the Vovcha River line, gaining control over additional parts of the residential area and the industrial area in the northwestern parts of the southern section of Vovchansk. The Russians are here working on expanding their zone of control to the south of the Vovchansk river line to build up their forces for offensive operations, to gain a proper foothold within the southern parts of Vovchansk, gain control over the railway and industrial area in the central parts of the town, and to gain full control over the settlement, to push the Ukrainians out of Vovchansk and establish it as a logistical hub for their own forces, to develop further offensive operations beyond Vovchansk in the Kharkiv section of the front line, here in the northeastern parts of the front line. Another important topic to be talking about is the next defensive positions that the Ukrainians are building in the Pokrovsk, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia regions. Something to note about these is that they are hastily built, and at the same time, the areas, the lands here beyond the Donetsk region are all flatlands. This means the Russian forces moving forward will be facing off against hastily built fortifications, unlike the well-built and well-planned fortifications they had to deal with in the Donetsk region, into more sparse and less defensible positions. Not to mention the geography does not play in favor of the Ukrainians anymore either. This means that the Russian forces will have a significantly better advantage moving forward into the Dnipropetrovsk region and in the Zaporizhia region once they pass through these initial defensive lines along the border areas and the first and second defensive lines in the Zaporizhia region. Once they pass through these defensive lines, the Russians will be facing much less resistance. If the Ukrainians are unable to properly man these fortifications as well, then the situation becomes very dire for their future defensive operations. In conclusion, the Russians continue defensive operations, pushing through the last remaining strong defensive positions of the Ukrainians, mainly centered around the Donetsk region, but also present within the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv regions. Once Russians gain control over the current fighting positions that are located throughout the front line, it is an opportunity for the Russians to launch larger scale offensive operations where they can look to outmaneuver Ukrainian forces, similar to the start of the war, but with the lessons learned from the combat. The Russians are not just exposed once they go into the open with a large armored convoy, as the Ukrainians have a lot of drones, but the Russians are building up their anti-drone capabilities with a well-organized push that has learned the lessons from the 3 years of the war and are being developed further beyond this to develop these new tactics, adjusting their fighting power to the obstacles. I believe the Russians would be able to launch a large-scale offensive where they not necessarily will capture tens of thousands of kilometers within a few days, but rather it is a much faster pace of advances where they can reach the outskirts of cities within weeks and siege these cities such as Zaporizhia, Pavlograd, Dnipro, or potentially even launching offensive operations, whether in the direction of Sumy, Chernihiv, or Kiev itself. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.